Kakis, and I'm very happy to moderate this interesting discussion. We are here today with a fantastic panel to discuss about the well-being challenges at sea. This is part of our effort to organize the upcoming conference for the marine seafarers' well-being and mental health. Actually, this is a taster for our workshop, and in order to early start this discussion with IMarEST community. But before starting, let me introduce our panelists. We have here with us Melanie White. Mel is a policy advisor at the UK Chamber of Shipping. Melanie is working mainly with crewing issues, but also contributes to the mental health plans of the UK Chamber of Shipping. It's worth to note that Mel has marine experience and used to be an ex-mariner. Also with us is Pav Hart-Premkumar, who is an occupational psychologist working for the MCA, the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, as a part of the Human Element Policy team. It is really a privilege working with this team at the MCA. This small team is doing exceptional and pioneering work. Sorry, Pav, I need to mention this. Also, from the Lloyds Register Foundation, we have Dr. Olivia Swift. Olivia is a senior program manager. For those that you are not familiar with Lloyds Register Foundation, this is a global charity contributing for the safety of for the safer world. Also, Olivia has spent some time at sea, and she worked with charities and maritime communities. Next is Dr. Volkan Arslan. Volkan is also working for the Lloyds Register as a senior member of their senior human factors team. Volkan is a naval architecture, and he has a PhD. His PhD degree is in human factors. Also with us is David Hammond, the Chief Executive Officer of Human Rights at Sea. David also has spent time at sea, and he used to be a veteran of Royal Marines. And also we have with us Stephen Jones, head of Seafarers of Happiness Index of Mission to Seafarers. So we have the discussion will go around with our panelists to discuss some questions that we have prepared for our panelists for an hour, and then we move on to a Q&A session with the audience for 30 minutes. Please upload your questions to the Slido, so in order to have the chance to interact with our panelists. We have some general discussion, some general questions for our panelists. So I will ask the question, and then we seek for opinions from each panelist. So the first question for you is, what are the main well-being challenges that have been highlighted within the maritime industry? I will start with Volkan, who is up the corner of my screen. Volkan?
Hi, Panos. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Well, I would like to start with, I think we can talk about well-being challenges for hours, but as you all know, the maritime environment is quite a challenging one. Long working hours and social isolation, etc., etc. However, I would like to summarize the well-being challenges by referring to our crew welfare survey that we have distributed back in June last year. And I can, I think, summarize the challenges under 4 main categories, and according to what we identified. And I would like to start with the first one, which is around the recognition and the value. And basically, we all say, yes, seafarers are essential workers. However, they don't feel so. And if you look into our survey results, only 8% of them feel that they're valued in their role. So we really see negative effects of this on their mental health. And yes, many countries pledge, and also they sign Neptune, lots of companies, they sign Neptune Declaration, but the crew change crisis is far from solved. And still we have lots to do around that. And the second challenge will be probably around stigma. And we all know about this very well, and it stops people asking for help. And we know how important it is if we could intervene timely, if someone is struggling or if they need to ask for a certain help. And I think the other main challenge we identified was around lack of health provisions. And what I mean by those, for example, lack of certain training, such as mental health first aid training, so people could know more about how to spot signs if someone's struggling. And other things would be lack of helplines posted, confidential helpline posted on board ships, or lack of like a general and informative really posters on board. So that could be another well-being challenge probably. And the last one I would like to talk about, we also identify many challenges around that's actually became a bigger issue with the COVID, disease management and treatment of seafarers, the quarantine periods. They all feel they're neglected. They didn't have proper communication channels, so they didn't know what was happening, why the certain decisions had to be made. And so these are, I would say, 4 main challenges as we identify as part of our crew welfare survey. But I know the panelists have a lot to add to this discussion.
I'm muted, sorry. Thank you, Volkan. That's very, very interesting feedback. Pav, what is, according to your view, the well-being challenges at sea?
So I'm going to kind of repeat some of the things that Volkan touched on. Stigma, I think definitely, not just internal stigma, you know, fear of kind of speaking up, but the external stigma and the idea that they, by reporting mental health issues, might get fired even, or just the perception that that might happen, even if it doesn't actually happen. The other thing I think we've, from a policy perspective, have found is so a lot of the interventions on well-being now are exactly that, interventions. So it's kind of coming after well-being issues have been reported, or, you know, it's kind of aimed at the seafarer. So I think we need to start focusing more on kind of organizations, getting them involved to make sure that the situations they're putting seafarers in the first place allow them to thrive. So we're not getting as far as a well-being issue being reported on board and then something being done about it. And the other thing I think definitely is kind of getting an international consensus on good well-being and how to improve well-being, in terms of, you know, the UK or even certain companies internationally might have great kind of attitudes towards well-being and environments on board. A seafarer steps off that ship, goes to another one, and then it's not so good. So, you know, we need to try and work towards a common understanding there of well-being, and that's quite a complicated issue.
Sorry. I'm really happy, Pav, for your review, but also I'm really happy to see a UK regulator to start discussing the well-being issues. That's really important, and I'm sure MCH it's the only one currently, and I hope in the near future to other regulators to follow. Next, Olivia, what is your view of the well-being challenges at sea?
Thanks, Panos. Nice big question to open with, isn't it? I think I want to add building on from what's already been said, is that there are, of course, two dimensions to it. So there are the particular moments, one we're in at the moment, which are particularly intense for seafarers. So currently that's to do with the pandemic and the crew change crisis and everything linked to that, vaccinations and so forth. Very different scenario, but a few years back when Indian Ocean piracy was at its peak, seafarers were facing a whole new range of extreme conditions, being held hostage in some cases, being under attack by pirates. So a real humanitarian crisis that hadn't been witnessed on that scale before. So there are snapshots where seafarers really are in the firing line, quite literally sometimes. And then there are the ongoing factors which overlap with one another. So the two I would cite based on what we know, and we do know a lot, there's a good body of research with seafarers, and they are fatigue and social isolation. And of course, both of those are caused by a multiple of things and have a multiple of effects. So it does become a bit of a web. But I think if you were to focus on just those two, you would in terms of psychological well-being and physical, you would certainly cover a lot of ground. Of course, it's easier said than done.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. Next, Mel. Mel, what is your view? What is the view of UK Chamber of Shipping? I know that the chamber you have a mental health program, but what do you consider the main well-being challenges at sea?
Thanks, Panos. And you had really beneficial views heard so far. And I think just to build on Vulcan's points, where there is this concern of seafarers about recognition and value, and particularly with the frame of light that we see ourselves currently with the pandemic. But I think all of us here are aware that this is mental health has been, the discussion has been around a lot longer than the pandemic, but now the pandemic's bringing it into light. And I think the most important part of those 4 key points that Vulcan's raised, and also the points that Olivia and Pav have raised, seems to all be steeped in communication, and the importance of that communication between companies and those on board ship. And as Pav has said, when one seafarer is going from one ship and might then be going to another one, and there's a huge disparity in terms of their treatment on board, or what they might be experiencing, or even just the nature of their work. There might be factors outside control. There might be weather. There's a whole catalogue of things that can impact seafarer well-being. And the really important point in terms of looking at this within the scope of policy and shipping companies is that shipping companies identify what vessels they have, and when they are implementing mental health policies, tailoring those to the specific needs and nature of those that are on board. And I think that's really the view of policy within the UK Chamber of Shipping, and certainly with the practical guidance that we've jointly put out with the unions, is the encouragement of these mental health policies being in place really need to be looking at a variety of factors which are very challenging. But those key points that were mentioned, such as recognition and value, stigma, health provisions, and disease management, are actually all holistically looked at throughout those policies. So just to add really to what the other panelists have said, and it's encouraging that we're all on the same page.
Perfect. Thank you, Mel. Stephen, what is your view about this?
Yeah, hi, thanks everyone. I think firstly to say that the Seafarers Happiness Index from the Mission Seafarers, I think the lessons that we're learning and the voices we're hearing from the sea would very much echo those that have been expressed before. So not wanting to go over that ground, I think we're all agreed on. I think it's really been important to see where the gaps are. And I think, you know, the big welfare challenges are invisibility, a lack of understanding of what seafarers do, and a little bit of, you know, a lack of accountability for some of those charged with the welfare issue. I think the crew change crisis has really illuminated a lot of issues, and they're not just the logistical issues of crew changes, they're the surrounding issues. I think in this question, it would be a case of looking at the top-down elements of that. And I think for an industry that's really talking about great modern technological changes of digitalization, of big data, all these things, we don't understand seafarers. There's only 1.5 million to 2 million seafarers. There's really not that many, you know, a small city's worth, if you like. So really we have to understand what they do, and maybe to kind of paraphrase Churchill, you know, rarely have so few done so much for so many. And that's the position we're in with seafarers. There is a lack of understanding, there is a lack of accountability, and I think it has to come from the top down. I think we can easily make a system, and I suggest it would probably be right that the IMO member states, through the IMO, have akin to the IMO number for ships, an IMO number for a seafarer. No one should be allowed to exist in the gaps or be in the shadows, not understood, suffering, and not having their voice heard. That, I believe, is the biggest fundamental welfare challenge for seafarers.
Thank you, Stephen. You raised a lot of issues. Thank you. David.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's also a privilege to be with my fellow speakers today on the panel. So from our perspective, and it's a civil society perspective looking in, the headlines for us really are that seafarers are both at a critical vulnerability and also the primary business enabler. And in a $17 trillion industry, it seems pretty crazy that we've got a failure to invest in the welfare sector. And in fact, welfare organisations have to scrimp and save for funds. And so when we're talking about challenges and we're talking about well-being, the headline words for us, and Stephen's just touched on one, is accountability, effective remedy or the lack of effective remedy, and in continuing impunity across the board in terms of the decision making at the highest level. So without repeating what other people have said, I wanted to just cover some refinements and other points. Again, from our experience, it's uncertainty for seafarers and families where there's been previous certainty in terms of contract length and crew change. This is an entirely new model, and it's whether or not we're going to return to what was deemed normality, or we are now in the new normality. And that links to loss of confidence in the system, in not just system of crew changes, despite all the best efforts by many corporate crew change management firms and individual owners, but a loss of confidence in that previous model. The other points I'd just like to raise briefly is that the lack of worker voice. I mean, true worker voice, not that worker voice that is diluted by the corporate CSR approach or firms that have the responsibility for reputation management. And then that goes back to uncertainty, it goes back to loss of confidence. That leads also to the points of criminalisation. We're dealing with a number of cases of the masters being criminalised and indeed blacklisted for standing up for their rights, which then leads to bullying and harassment, of course, brought in to the forefront in the last number of years by the MLC amendments. And then to finally finish off again from what's coming to our organisation, when you look at social isolation, which has been raised earlier, it's social isolation, which is increasingly a result of increased technology and isolation within cabins, as opposed to common crew messing and common unity on board the vessel. And the final point I'd like to make is that not many people have actually highlighted the focus on the welfare teams, on the unions, on the teams who are actually running around to drive policy, to pick up all of these issues. And I think we also need to acknowledge that whilst the seafarers have got problems with burnout, forced labour conditions, abuses of labour and human rights. That burnout is also at the higher level as well, with organisations, those with limited resources, but also those with a lot of resources and people working continuously on this issue. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. What are the most effective ways we can continue to support seafarers and promote positive well-being? Yeah, let's go to the solutions. David, I will start with you. So what you can see as solutions? What do you see? How we can promote positive well-being?
So I'm going to go back to those three. Thank you. I'll go back to those three headline sets of words: accountability, effective remedy, and impunity. At the highest level, at the strategic level, with the IMO, we need to see at least a majority consensus on the likes of key worker status, but that should be unanimous. And if it's not unanimous, that goes back to my earlier point of a loss of confidence in the system. So the most effective way at the strategic end, we can address this, I say we, the IMO, the flag states can address it, is one of unity in message, noting that individual national positions are a priority at during this pandemic. Second of my 3 points would be we've got to provide independent platforms and support independent platforms, such as Stephen's work that he's doing, and other organisations that are doing survey. And we need to be able to get the seafarers to feel empowered to be able to tell their stories and their issues in complete confidence, which goes back to the earlier points of bullying, blacklisting, and lack of worker voice because of confidence in the system. And then finally, we've got to maintain honest conversations. We can't be dressing them up as behind corporate or legal veils or part of some CSR or ESG exercise. We've got to tell it how it is. We can't shy away from the tough truths, and we don't want to be toning down the realities at the front end when it's not good. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks. As I said, I think the crew change crisis really illuminated and the light has spilled out onto other issues. And I think the real fundamental issue regarding welfare and well-being on board is the fact, and it's something that we keep hearing time and time again in the happiness index results, is that too few people doing too much work on board. There is a fundamental problem with minimum safe manning and the compliance rather than exceeding those levels. Seafarers do not feel that there is the capability on board to get all the work done within the amount of time available to do it, which has a huge impact. That's where we get fatigue, that's where we get the stress, the isolation, the illness, all the various negative aspects of well-being. So much of it stems from too few people being on board. I think also it does have an impact on the social life as well. If there is no one to go and socialize with, then you go to your cabin and you socialize if you've got connectivity, and if not, then that's another problem itself. Certainly from the COVID perspective, we've heard from seafarers of huge increases in the amount of work to manage COVID, to manage things like hygiene on board. So an already stressed workforce with lots of things to do, because seafaring has carried on at a relentless pace, whereas the rest of society seems to lock itself away making banana bread. Seafarers have been working full tilt to bring us everything that society needs. No let up in that. And whereas seafarers, my impression is that they've built the coping mechanisms to get through, as David touched upon, a certainty. There was a certainty in trip length, and they were kind of able to deal with that, get themselves through and get home and then recharge their batteries at home. Now that we're seeing real problems with getting home, it's just exacerbated every single aspect and problem. and there are simply not enough people on board to deal with this. I personally think that the minimum manning model I think we need from an industry perspective, and perhaps led by charterers, is to term it differently. This is lowest possible crewing levels. And if you employ ships that constantly use the lowest possible allowable crewing levels, then that has to have an impact somewhere along the chain, and perhaps we're not exploring those weak links adequately enough. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Mel?
Thanks, Panos. Just to go back on the ways in which we can support the seafarers, I think this is where it's important, where if we see how the pandemic has actually shaped people on land's view of mental well-being, for the first time, people ashore have some level of understanding of what it might be like to live in some kind of isolation, to have activities restricted from them that they would normally rely on in order to stay mentally well. And I think actually this is the really important fork in the road for the maritime industry, where we have a very unique situation, which means that there might be compassion to some extent from those ashore to actually understand what it might be like to be at sea. And I think when looking at the challenges that seafarers face, and in order to promote that positive well-being, as well as making sure that we keep the momentum of this discussion going in the way in which the pandemic has brought it to light, we ideally need to encourage every aspect of the industry to look holistically at mental well-being. And one of the prime important messages normally is, in order to stay mentally well and to support others feeling well, you need to feel mentally well in yourself. And much as the others have mentioned, people are at burnout, both at sea, ashore, both in the maritime sector, and organisations that are trying to facilitate crew changes, etc. So if we can look after ourselves, we can look after those around us. And if people are going to implement mental health policies that are going to be long-lasting, a really important way that we can support our seafarers is actually ensure that those policies include them, and that they can hear it and that they can feel it. And I think whenever we discuss mental well-being, that's the crux. Can they feel it on board? And provided that message can get to them, then whatever step we decide to take first actually will have impact. And especially when there are a whole range of ways in which mental well-being is very complex, wherever we start on the number of lists of things that are really trying for seafarers, as long as they can feel and hear that those ashore are there to support them, then that will inevitably help this situation. And that goes whether it's to do with crew changes and explaining why there might be a delay, or actually what different governments are doing and the complexities of that and when they're traveling, or whether it's actually ensuring that people are actively connecting with the ship and asking what are the challenges on board and how can we help implement policies that actually will help you. And I think bringing seafarers into those policies is really one of the most important ways that we can support them on this area.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Mel. Olivia, what do you think? How can we support seafarers and promote positive well-being?
Thanks, Panos. Interesting what Mel's just said, and echoed earlier comments around the needs for seafarers to feel cared for in simple terms. So absolutely agree, and there's no buts. I think about this in relation to two aspects, but perhaps now there are three actually, to include Mel's. And I suppose the point I want to make is that we need to attend to both of the two. So they are the long-term causes of wellbeing challenges, as well as the initiatives that support individual seafarers to build their resilience and to treat individual seafarers once they are unwell. And of course, we need both. In fact, we need all three. So we need to look at the long-term causes and address those. We need to support the individuals, and we need to involve the individuals in both. Obviously, they're involved in the latter, but in the discussion and the steps we can take to make long-term change. At Lloyds Register Foundation, because we're not a humanitarian maritime charity that deals with relief initiatives, we're inherently interested in the long-term change that can be put in place for, particularly in relation to safety outcomes. So, and I'll come on later with some of the things we're doing in that space. So the first point was that, about looking at both the sort of band-aid initiatives as well as the prevention in the long term. And the other thing I wanted to say, and this leads on from Steve's point earlier, is that we do have too few seafarers on board, and that will only increase as a problem as systems become more automated and more complex. And so I have a question as to whether we are thinking ahead enough about the increased pressure and responsibility and stress put on those who do remain, and in particular, where the point of tip over is in terms of cognitive overload and stress overload. I suppose the two go together. So, it's something that's looked at in human factors work, but are we as an industry thinking enough about that point of cognitive overload?
Thank you, Livia. Thank you. Volkan?
Well, thanks, Panos. I think other panelists talk about all the important aspects. Probably I can talk about some practical examples that I have come across with within the maritime industry to best support seafarers, really. And for example, I would like to mention about some shipping companies. They recorded podcasts, and senior managers, executive leadership, they talk about their own mental health. Because, we know that stigma, it's a massive challenge and it acts as a massive barrier, that's why. And so just hearing, and for all seafarers, when they hear from senior management the daily struggles they have, they feel more empowered to speak up and just to also talk about their own mental health and mental struggles as well. So that's one of the effective way to deal with this issue. And the other thing I briefly mentioned about the communication and how it's important. If you want this to be effective, and it is human nature to know why, so it is very important we communicate the underlying logic behind these decisions. And I don't want to reiterate what I said before, but for example, seafarers would like to know if they have quarantine for 2 weeks, and if they all tested negative, why they still need to maintain their physical distancing, and that's because that increases the social isolation on board. So in terms of the most effective ways of supporting seafarers, probably these are some practical aspects that I have come across while talking with shipping companies and seafarers. Personally, I can add to this discussion probably.
Thank you, Volkan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Volkan. Pav, as a regulator, MCA, what is planning to do to support the seafarers? I know you have published some guides for the crew, but also for companies, and also you are planning to launch a well-being tool. So this is what I know, but in general, what MCA is planning to do about this?
So in terms of supporting seafarers, I think we kind of, aside from what the panelists have already said and covered, one of the main issues is also giving seafarers the confidence and the tools to report issues when they are happening, and report when things are going wrong or near misses even, because we're getting to the point now where as an industry, we're talking about mental health, we're doing it quite well, I think, or we're beginning to start looking at it quite well, and we're giving all these seafarers training, but what we don't have yet is, again, that kind of organizational buy-in so much in terms of making the environment better. But part of that includes having ways to report when something's an issue, or even allowing seafarers the time in their busy schedules to suddenly say, oh, actually, this happened at work today and that wasn't so good. And we're not doing that very well as an industry. We're not reporting things because A, seafarers are busy, they don't have the time. B, we just don't have those kind of reporting systems in place. And then also that kind of attitude of getting on with it instead of that could have led to an accident or that could have led to an issue, so I need to flag that up. So I think, as Panel said, we're working on kind of looking at tools where these issues can be flagged up, that the organizations can have a look at them before they become an accident or an incident, because we really should be looking at preventing these things from happening in the first place and looking at putting policies in place as a regulator, but also within companies, to make sure that we're providing seafarers with everything they need to choose an environment that's right for them, instead of having to choose an environment and hope for the best.
Thank you, Pab. I would like to remind our audience to upload their questions to Slido. I've seen questions are coming, so I hope the discussion will become more interesting the next minutes. So we are moving to the next set of questions. I'm going through to each panelist to give some questions. Mel, about you. How do the Chamber mental health practical guidelines address well-being challenges? How are they aimed at?
Thanks, Panos. So this year, in March 2021, the UK Chamber of Shipping, along with RMT and Nautilus International, published practical guidance for shipping companies on improving mental well-being, and that's as part of the National Maritime Occupational Health and Safety Committee. So that's jointly the Chamber and the unions looking at guidance to companies, practical guidance on how they can implement mental health policies. And within that guidance, we've taken best practice examples from companies and placed them in the guidance to show what other companies are doing. What's really important within the guidance is that, as we know, the maritime industry is very vast and there are multiple ways in which ships operate. And so really important parts of that document is to show the examples as ideas that companies take them on with a view of how their own company runs, and then ascertaining what might work best. So some examples might work well within one framework, and someone might want to adopt those ideas in a different way. But it's to try and encourage this discussion and to show that this isn't something to put into the it's too difficult drawer. There are companies that are doing well, and there are companies that are at the beginning of this journey. And it's really about identifying where you are and starting there. What's been mentioned already from Volkan is a really important thing, and that is the importance of top level leadership, understanding why mental health and well-being is beneficial to everybody involved. And mental health policies that have the best impact will be led from the top. And that's a really important part, and that's mentioned within the guidance. But another element is looking at really unique areas of how can you impact the mental well-being on board through a holistic approach. So what are we looking at nutrition? How are we bringing in a ship's cook into their important part of looking after the crew on board and feeding them? That's within their remit and their control, and it's their job. That's also the focal point for when people meet. That's hopefully going to encourage social interaction. What role can they play, and what can shipping companies do to encourage understanding of how important that role is? And looking at all of the areas of the vessel and how they all are important, in seafarer mental well-being. I think one other thing I'd like to say about the guidance is that it encourages companies to look at mental well-being with a health and safety focus. So to conduct a risk assessment of the environment on board. And I hear, oh, well, maybe I haven't heard this yet, but I imagine people going, oh, not more paperwork. But actually, this is really important to understand what areas need looking at, and where are the possible gaps where people might then not put their hand up and say, I need support here. And in understanding the mental well-being of seafarers through these risk assessments, hopefully a company will have a good outlook and outline of where they need to look at improving. And this guidance is there to support that, but hopefully we can continue building on it. And as more companies are becoming more attuned and refining their mental health policies, ensuring this document remains live, and actually progressing the industry so that we're not always just acting out of crisis.
Thanks, Mel. This is really important that there are guidelines for policies. And just to add that this policies is not just good for the people, for the crew, but it's also beneficial for the business itself. Okay, next question is to David. David, what have been the main barriers highlighted in relation to support provision and human rights for seafarers?
Thank you. We've broken it down to 5 main barriers. There's a lot more, but we don't have time to go into them. And again, I'm going to return to those 3 words, but well, 3 sets of words of accountability, remedy, and impunity. But I'm also going to add in transparency. So with those in the back of your mind, the 5 barriers are a lack of interest in human rights, a lack of necessity to address it, tribalism and protectionism, a lack of worker voice, and I'm talking about raw worker voice, and a fear of reprisals. So breaking those down. Until really last year, there was minimal shipping industry engagement on human rights protections and safeguards, and it's been left to other people to champion. It's a lack of interest. Human Rights C was seen as a deflection from the MLC, though noting as a matter of fact, the words human rights do not once feature explicitly in the MLC. Quite remarkable in the position we now find ourselves in. And to a degree, as it was seen as an annoyance and it was just another set of paperwork. We'll dial forward now and look at the crew change crisis, the pandemic, and human rights is really at the forefront. So the barrier there was a lack of interest. The necessity is that pandemic has now made it a catalyst. You've now got the outreach to the UN entities. You've got it stated as a humanitarian crisis. You've got the UN Secretary General stating that we need to look at crew change, stop a humanitarian crisis, and have key worker status alongside Secretary General IMO, etc. And of course, last week we have the UN toolkit for business and human rights due diligence. Well, that would not have existed 12 months ago. Because of the lack of interest in human rights. Failure to cooperate, that sector protectionism of a ring fencing around what exists, whereas instead of not looking forward, not having that future forward looking of what are the challenges to the industry. And human rights isn't a challenge, it's a fundamental right. So before we protect our crew going to sea and being at sea, we need to protect their fundamental rights under the 48 Declaration and the Bill of Rights. Very rarely have we heard that even talked about prior to 2020. And then to sort of wrap up, I've spoken about, I'm going to keep returning to this lack of what I call raw workers' voice without the corporate reputational management influences, the corporate barriers and the legal veils. They are, I say they, the seafarers and their families, because people have not yet spoken about the ripple effect into the families. They are the rights holders directly, not the lawyers, insurers, managers, ourselves sat in our rooms where we are. We of course are rights holders, but in this focus, the seafarers are the primary rights holders. And then finally, the fear of reprisals. That really is a barrier. We spoke about barriers in the question to a lack of trust in a freedom of expression. Blacklisting, as we've said, and seafarers, we're dealing with a number of cases at the moment. Just keep an eye out for the BBC in the next weeks or so. Seafarers are the easiest target to blame. Why? Because it's easy to deflect the mistakes to those without a voice. And my final point to those on this webinar is, if you were to ask me, would human rights have come to the forefront of the narrative in the absence of COVID-19? My simple answer is no.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you. Next question. Now, this is for Olivia and Volkan. What the group, what has the group been doing to explore the challenges associated with seafarer well-being? What is the focus and initiative of the group for this? Olivia, would you like to start?
Sure, I can do. So Lloyds Register Foundation and Lloyds Register Group, of course, as separate but joined entities, work together in this space in complementary ways, and that we share a mission to engineer a safer world in simple terms. So I'll speak for the foundation's part, which is really more about that long-term prevention that I've talked about. That said, we have in our portfolio of grants in the past, we've funded projects that have worked on subjects such as crew accommodation, ship-shore communications, crewing patterns, and so forth, all of which have very clear well-being implications. And those well-being implications in relation to safety continue to be important for us in making sure seas are a safe place to work in. Now, we have 3 projects at the moment that I think are worth mentioning, and I'll do that as briefly as possible. One is a piece of work that evaluates the effectiveness of existing initiatives that support seafarers' psychological well-being. And that's because building the evidence base is a really important part of our strategy as a charity. And then the other 2 projects relate as well. The first is a call for insight that is live, that Nottingham Trent University is running for us, following on from a report they published last year on psychological well-being in relation to safety. And that's asking organisations, particularly from Maritime, to share insights, data, conversations with them so that they can collate actionable learning from the pandemic about the sorts of, that provides clarity about the terminology and models that particularly safety and health professionals can use to make sure that learning from this current crisis can be embedded in a really practical way longer term. So that project is particularly in relation to COVID, but it's again about that longer term piece. And then the third project is in conjunction with Seafarers Hospital Society and Yale University, who are doing the 2 of those partners are doing a long-term piece of research on existing health and safety provision for seafarers. And we're joining them for 2 roundtables in June and July, the 29th of June and 15th of July. That's really a chance to hear from shipping companies, as opposed to seafarers, in confidence, what companies feel is actually doable in terms of those long-term changes to support well-being. So it's an opportunity for a Chatham House frank discussion about what they've tried and what's worked and what hasn't. So what's affordable, what's of interest, what is completely impossible, so that we can try and counter the research we have on seafarers' perspectives with an industry take that ideally will produce some indices about what's impactful and practical, so that we can move the recommendations that are published from the research into some action around things like, training, interpersonal relations on boards, organizational culture. There's more sort of messy structural stuff. So hopefully that will be useful. And anyone wanting more information about those, please do get in touch.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. Volkan, do you have to add anything from your end on this?
Yeah, maybe just I can add a couple of points. And so first of all, in terms of exploring challenges, And as a law group, we have been looking to both physical, actually, and mental well-being challenges within the industry. I think it is also important to note that. And so, very briefly, when we have distributed this crew welfare survey, it is important to note this wasn't a research project. We all wanted to identify the efficacy of measures and what kind of support be provided. And so we could share these lesson learned information with the other industrial partners, other stakeholders. And so we have been doing that to explore challenges. And so we, on a regular basis, we talk with shipping companies and representatives. As part of our job, also we interview sometimes people, we talk to seafarers, observe them at their workplace. So we do lots of projects to explore the challenges relevant to their well-being as well, both on board ships and remotely nowadays mostly. And also we attend technical and advisory committee meetings to further explore their challenges and to define how to best support them, really. And so in addition to what all the good work LR Foundation has been doing, we had a very close relationship with shipping companies. We're providing more closer support for them one-to-one. As I can summarize in that way.
Thank you, Volkan. Thank you. Pav, Pav, I have this big question for you. How is seafarer well-being addressed in policy? Are there particular areas where it is more challenging, and why?
So in terms of our policy at the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, in the human element team, we've certainly been putting well-being at the forefront of our strategy for a couple of years now. And wider in the MCA, that's reflected in the fact that we are branded as the ethical and responsible flag of choice. So what that means is that we're making sure that any service we provide is holistic. We're not just interested in the commercial aspects of shipping. We are looking at putting seafarer safety and health at the forefront. And in terms of our work specifically in the human element team over the past couple of years, you've given a few examples already, Panos. We've published guidance on well-being for seafarers and organisations in the Wellbeing at Sea books, a guide for organisations and a pocketbook for seafarers, which the aim of that was to start kicking off this discussion, providing pragmatic advice on board for seafarers as well as policy advice for organisations, so that we have this top-down and bottom-up approach to looking at well-being. And I think where we really see our role within policy is to kind of be at the forefront in terms of making sure that we're keeping the momentum of discussing well-being, doing things to improve well-being, and working with as many people in the industry as possible. So we make sure we're part of pretty much most panel discussions and special interest groups, and we're always open to collaborating in the industry because great things are being done. I think it's just about making sure that we're all approaching this in a linked up way as one industry. So then that kind of brings us on to, I suppose, the challenges of policy. So I think the biggest challenge so far is working well-being into some sort of legislation. And where do we start with that? And is it relevant? So some of the challenges are, if we put some sort of legislation in place, the unfortunate truth is legislation will always work to the minimum standards. So trying to get people who do nothing about well-being to do a little bit or do something. And so that ignores all the kind of great work that is going on in the industry. So then that brings us on to, well, is that useful? Is it useful to force people to do something about well-being? And the answer is usually no, because companies who are taking notice and doing a great job are doing better than any legislation could tell them to do. Companies who are doing nothing, just because we're forcing them to do it doesn't mean they'll do any better. So that's kind of one of the big issues. And we also don't want well-being to become a tick box exercise. So the problem is you introduce legislation and people stop being innovative because they think, okay, well, I'll just do what it says and then that's it, that I've done my bit for well-being. And really it's more, I think, in terms of well-being, about opening up discussion and making sure that we're going together as an industry. We're not telling people what to do, we're learning from each other in terms of best practice. And obviously that can be difficult because internationally, like I said before, there's such a difference in well-being and what different countries are doing in terms of well-being or regulating well-being. So as much as it would be useful to try and get some legislation to do with well-being, I think we're at a point now where, you know, we've got these resources, these companies, the companies that are on this represented on this panel, who are doing great work. And I think our place as a regulator is to show off that great work as an example of what we can kind of achieve around the world. So yeah, going back to what our workload, we've got the Wellbeing at Sea publications. We've released MIN 656, which is about understanding the long-term impacts of COVID on seafarer wellbeing, which we published in March. We've also made amendments to our MGN 505, which is about fatigue. And in the future, we are looking at the wellbeing tool, which hopefully should provide organisations and seafarers a way to kind of flag up any wellbeing issues on board. And yeah, I think it's about kind of working together as an industry next to see how we can make wellbeing a part of every policy rather than just the wellbeing policy.
Thank you, Pav. You give us a very positive message now. This is very positive, and I hope this to affect other regulators, other countries to follow your example. Steve, this is the last question before going to the Q&A with the audience. So, Stephen, what are the key trends we are seeing from the Seafarers Happiness Index over the last 12 months? Is this very different from the pre-COVID picture?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for more than 12 months now, there's obviously been a serious problem. I think just, you know, one of the things I've certainly seen is there's a slight danger in, you know, training seafarers to look after their own well-being, wellness, trying to train them to be more resilient, because there's a danger that, you know, in teaching someone to hold their hand in the fire longer, then we should be putting the flames out rather than, you know, any kind of suggestion that seafarers should be better able and equipped to cope with things that they shouldn't be having to face and be equipped to deal with. So there's certainly been a little bit of that message coming through from seafarers. I think there are some good things that have emerged in the past year. There's certainly been some growing investment from owners in issues such as connectivity, and I think that's really been extremely well received by seafarers who've been fortunate enough to get those kind of benefits that have come along. Seafarers, ship owners have also invested in, some have, in improving food and also facilities on board. So in not necessarily being able to impact the crew change, they have at least done something, albeit small scale, things that have made a difference. So that's been good. But in the main, it's been a kind of trend of dropping kind of satisfaction and happiness levels from seafarers. Certainly the first 2 quarters of 2020, there was a real dropping away in that, as we saw a real kind of trough. Then strangely, as things, I guess, globally looked like they were steadying and things were improving, the mood improved as well. I think there was a sense and a feeling and a hope that things were going to be fixed, and, you know, they were going to be able to get home, things were going to be fixed, and it may be okay after all. What we're seeing now is that tipping point exactly away from that, and I have real grave concerns about what the implications are in that seafarers have felt some growing optimism that the problems would be solved, and now it looks as if they're going to perhaps get even worse than they were before. There'd been lots of talk on board of growing friction and tensions. Only, really expect those to worsen greatly if we are going into, as we suspect, a kind of really second wave of a COVID crew change crisis. So I think over the year I likened it a little bit to the stages of grief. There was that kind of denial initially, and then anger, bargaining, depression, and then a form of kind of grudging acceptance that the world was suffering. So obviously crew changes will be impacted to an extent. That was kind of the holding pattern. I think I worry now that if we do see this second wave as we expect, then the anger and the depression will be the overwhelming kind of sense on board most ships. So that's been the kind of journey through the past year.
Thank you, Stephen. So we are moving now to the Q&A, the questions uploaded to Slido. I've seen a lot of questions are coming, but I will try to organize these questions, to group these questions. Please continue to upload your questions, and we'll try to answer most of them. The first question is about the internet connectivity. There is some controversy about this. Some people believe that this will increase the well-being, and others that believe that access to free access to internet will increase the stress. So, how would you like to comment on this? Pab, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, so I agree with both. I'm sure that it will have negative impacts in some places and positive impacts in others. The thing is, I think we now as a generation expect to be connected at all times, and that is just the way of the world, and that is the way things are going. And I understand that obviously for seafarers, it's not always helpful to get especially bad information from home whilst they're at work. But I think we need to look at this in a different way. We need to look at it from the point of view of when is it acceptable to be looking at your phone and when is it not. For example, if you're at work, maybe don't look at your phone, and that's just a policy the companies have to manage themselves. I suppose the other issue is giving people internet access going to force them to sit or make them sit in their cabins a bit more and not interact socially. And again, I think you need to think about that as a company in terms of what you're allowing on board and what you can do to encourage interaction on board. So just a few things like making sure that you have joint events and activities put in place. Just something as simple as that seafarers can take part in, because I don't think anyone joins a ship and thinks, okay, I don't want to talk to anyone and I want to sit in my room all day. I think that's just kind of a symptom of kind of a bigger cause or a bigger issue on board. So I don't think giving seafarers connectivity is the issue. I think it's about managing connectivity and managing the issues behind why they might be using or abusing them.
Okay, thanks, Pab. Anyone to comment on this before? Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pav hit the nail on the head there. I think, if you don't have anything else to do, if you don't have anyone else to talk to, and if there is nowhere else to go other than your cabin, then that's what you will do. If there are people to talk to, if there's nice things to do, and if it's a nice social place where people can enjoy the company of others, then they will go and do that. And I think, the message from seafarers comes across extremely clear and extremely loud. They want connectivity. So people who kind of those desires are usually doing so because they don't want to pay for the connectivity. So I think we should listen to the arguments of both sides, but understand where they come from sometimes and the drivers behind them.
Thank you, Stephen. Personally, I would like to be connected, especially now with remote working. So let's go to the next question about the status of key workers. Why do you think this the status this idea met with a lot of resistance with too many countries? Anyone to take this question? Mel?
Something that the UK Chamber had noticed when interacting with people from our European counterparts was that the term key worker and also essential worker, some countries have adopted the term essential worker, and therefore within that there can be discrepancy in how some states want to take on that information. And so that's been, I think, a real challenge on a global scale when looking at policy and looking at individual terms and how each country has tried to mitigate what has happened during the pandemic is in those early stages when terms such as essential worker have been taken on by a country. Then when key worker is used, even something as small as that could be a reason why that's not taken up on a higher level. And so it's really of utmost importance that states are looking at their seafarers as key workers or essential workers. And a third of the member states as part of IMO, it would be great to see 100%. And if we're going to recognise our seafarers as the important people they are, that's really important. But just to give a framework of why there might be why on earth anybody wouldn't designate them, there has been discussions of how it has been difficult in some foreign language speaking countries to interchange essential worker and key worker. So that could be a reason.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Let's move on to the next question about the hours of rest. It seems that the hours of rest sometimes are violated, and it seems that it's difficult to regulate this, and there is no incentive. How can, because seafarers are viewed as cheap labor, as this the exact comment from the question. How can address this issue? It's already mentioned it, but how can make to ensure that rest hours are respected and implemented? Anyone to take this question? Volkan?
I think I can say a couple of things. It's a well-known fact that work and rest hours are falsified within the industry, unfortunately. I think the one way to look into that issue is just, lots of auditors and inspectors go on board, and as part of ISO, now we are in a good place, and also some of the mental well-being issues will be considered as part of the ISO occupational health and safety guidelines. So let's get back to the work and rest hours. I think it is very important. This is taken very seriously. And if companies start, and I know this may sound a bit like extreme, but if they start a bit more punished for this falsified records, I think then they will start looking into this issue properly, and hopefully amount of these falsified records will decrease. That's probably, it's unfortunate, I need to say, the maritime industry is a bit reactive, and they are scared of, unfortunately, these kind of, it is not the right approach we would like to see, especially from anyone in the maritime world. But unfortunately, they care the most about these repercussions, really. That's why that could be a way to go forward.
Thank you, Volkan. Any other to comment before moving to the next, Stephen?
I think one of the ways that I touched upon it earlier is this issue of minimum manning and the impact on the hours of work and rest. And I think there seems to be too comfortable and easy an assumption made, perhaps in flag states, that you know, a ship that operates to the minimum will also be able to miraculously manage its working load. And I would question that. I would suggest that a vessel that is always working with the minimum level of crew, there will not be a level of compliance throughout a year or two, whatever period we decide. So I think, you know, by looking at those issues, we can start to see the honest picture and the honest relationship between the actual workforce on a ship and the actual tasks that are completed. And until we really kind of start making assumptions, you know, that wow, this is amazing that you're managed to juggle all these demands on your ship with the fewest possible people. Why aren't we asking questions in those terms? We're too comfortable with the answers that perhaps as an industry we want to hear, rather than the realistic approach that we should be hearing.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, Olivia, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Just briefly, I mean, and in addition, we need to look forward as well. You know, it probably requires a legislative change, which, as we know, takes an awful long time. But this is the point to really be advocating for that when IMO is looking at its, well, SOLAS, for example, in relation to the requirements of increasing autonomy and so forth. And surely crewing levels are a critical bit of that. So if we can look at short-term fixes, perhaps along the lines that Vulcan suggests, but also advocate as an industry collectively for an automated future which has more than minimal human presence, then that is, we need both of those in place at the same time.
Thank you, Olivia. The next question is there a difference between happiness and well-being? Also, this is my question also. I can understand the difference between happiness and well-being. Anyone to comment on this? Pav?
Okay, I'm going to have a go. So I think well-being is kind of holistic. Happiness is a mood. So I can be unhappy, but still be relatively well in my life, because I might be unhappy just right now for a few moments about an immediate situation. Whereas I think well-being is more about kind of a feeling of being in your optimum state, meaning that you're thriving in life. And I think happiness is related. Hopefully, if you've got great well-being, you will be happy generally. But I think in terms of, I see happiness in terms more of a mood. And, you know, we all know there are little things during our workday that can really annoy us. It doesn't mean that our whole life is awful. Whereas, yeah, if well-being is kind of that holistic environment that allows you to thrive mentally, physically, externally. Yeah.
Thanks, Pav. Stephen, I think do you want to add something on this?
Well, I'm always asking seafarers whether they feel happy or not, so I suppose it's it's a strange one, because I think I do agree with Pav there that, you know, oh, I feel happy now or feel sad now. It's not having a huge impact on my own, you know, well-being. But equally, ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, in every relationship, you know, at some point someone will ask, oh, are you happy? You know, and it does come down to a hugely fundamental issue. Are you happy? If you feel happy, then it doesn't matter how you term it, and we're each individuals, we all have our own kind of switches, triggers, etc. Fundamentally, if you feel happy, then you will be able to cope, you will be able to get through, you will have the resilience that we're hoping that seafarers have. And, you know, lest we forget that seafarers are incredibly resilient. It takes a lot of resilience to pack your bag, leave your house and go off over the horizon. And, you know, we've been doing it for centuries, millennia, if not. And, you know, so there is a huge, you know, sense of resilience within seafarers. And you ask them if they feel happy. Some open up about huge, you know, life-changing philosophies and the impact on them. Others talk about whether they can get hold of one of them was a wild boar and chili jam sandwich. You know, so we each of us have our own views of what happiness is and how it impacts our life, whether just a snapshot or whether the entire whole
Thanks, Stephen. Let's move on to a very interesting question. This is a really great question. How do we move from surveys, campaigns, and isolated actions to something more structured and organized, such as well-being policies, programs, and company commitment? So to make things happening for the benefit of both companies and crew people. Who would like to start with this question? Mel?
That's not an easy one to answer, because I think it's I think maybe the more I speak, the more confusing it will get. But ever is the case with policy, I think. Hopefully not, but especially with mental well-being, I think the best place we can all start is actually understanding what mental well-being means and what mental well-being means to us. And I think if we can encourage an industry to understand just that one line, well, what is my mental health or mental well-being, or not even what is well-being, and what does it mean to me? If you can start there and everybody has an understanding of what that is, then the other things that are more complex, it's a multifaceted area, and to get it right or perceived as right is extremely difficult, as we've been speaking about the last hour or so. But I think this goes back to perhaps even, well, what is happy? Are we able to understand that we all have mental health, that we all sit on a spectrum, and we fluctuate on that spectrum from mentally well to mentally unwell? Everybody does throughout their life. And it might be that we have periods of feeling fairly unwell based on either external factors or something might be diagnosable, but you can actually thrive with a mental health condition, and you can work well with a diagnosable mental health, or if you have a mental health condition. So I think perhaps I might extrapolate it to try and make it as simple as possible, and that is, until we all understand what mental well-being is to ourselves, that is the best way in which we can start tackling the larger beast, as it were.
Thanks, Mel. Any other comment? Okay, I will take Olivia, and then we'll move on to Pav. Olivia?
Thank you. I'm sensing perhaps a degree of cynicism in the question, and forgive me if that's incorrect, or perhaps I'm projecting. Personally, I feel like there is an awful lot of discussion around seafarer well-being for very good reason, and I have to admit it's a bit overwhelming. But I suppose my answer to the question, which will be as frustrating, well, probably will still frustrate the person who answered it, is patience, in that if you think back to Chernobyl, it's only now that we really have a safety culture that started at that point. And I have my Lloyds Register Group Directors of Health and Safety to thank for this important insight. So I'm citing him in that sense, James Pomeroy, for those who know him. And he made this really important point that stuck with me, and that we are this is a very new field, not just in maritime, but more widely. And although it feels as if it's something we've been talking about a lot in relation to COVID, and then in the last 10 years or so, in the scheme of things, that is not a long time. And we have policies in place, we have practices in place, we have a degree of regulatory change, but unfortunately we have to weather this storm of attention, and it takes time for things to really embed. So I think patience is my answer to that one.
Bob?
Yeah, kind of agreeing obviously with everything that's kind of just been said. I think the other thing is that seafarers need to realize how much power they have in this. So, there is a lot of good work being done, and with any social change, the way it starts is when the people being affected by it speak up and say, I'm being affected by this isn't acceptable. So I think with organizations definitely do play a key role, but the biggest factor that's going to make poor organizations change is seafarers refusing to work for them and refusing to deal with the conditions that, you know, that they shouldn't have to deal with. And I know it's not that easy, there's not always that choice, but there is always a way to say, you know, this isn't acceptable, to speak up, and also to, as Mel said, to understand what well-being is, understand what it means, so that you're not just looking after your own well-being, you're looking after the well-being of the people around you. And that doesn't mean you have to, you know, be their doctor. It just means simple things like asking, are you okay? You don't seem okay. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. David?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Pav was saying there. I think we also need to put this in context. You know, if you're working for Maersk and you're on a large, well set up vessel within a large global conglomerate, then I think there is certainly an environment, and it could be any carrier, for example, but there is an environment in which, you know, there are policies, there's good ship management, etc., and there's good welfare crew access for crew welfare and mental health support. But that is not the 1.6 million seafarers. You know, as Stephen said, it's the size of a small city. It's Glasgow, actually, in Scotland, as an example. But, you know, we can only go on the cases that come across us. And, you know, this isn't the top, you know, gold standard shipping company. Most don't have a choice. Most don't have ability to have a voice. If they do say something, they are blacklisted. They don't work again. The effect is that they are the main breadwinner within their family and their extended family. And I've been on the ground in India, and I've given all the money I've had out of my own pocket to a family who had nothing, because of a seafarer was blacklisted and was taken out of a company for raising his voice as a rights holder. So I think we just need to balance this conversation, that it's not all the A-class gold standard shipping companies here. There is an entire grey flag, black flag listed under the, you know, Tokyo and Paris MOUs that people don't really want to discuss, because they say, well, that's the bad end of our industry and therefore it taints us, but we're all doing fine. But we've got to look at the majority of those seafarers which are actually at the lower end. And I think we need to be very careful not to just say everybody's in ice white standing on the bridges of well-painted ships, which we know is not the case.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really glad that this question covers so many comments. So let's move on to the next question. Okay, so any policy or system must be broad and dynamic enough to encapsulate the broad range of cultural differences on board and the respective protected status of each. Yeah, it's very common to see various nationalities on board the same ship. I have first-hand experience on this. So, what about the multicultural aspect? How can approach this? Does this affect the mental health and well-being? Mel?
Thank you. I guess I'm going to come back again to that really practical response of, I think, yes, multicultural nature of shipping is what makes it wonderful. It also makes it extremely challenging. And I think looking at particularly the example I gave earlier of if people have autonomy and they can be proud of their culture and they can demonstrate to each other and share with each other what's wonderful about their culture, then that's actually a method of communication on board. And perhaps when looking at one of the most obvious ways of seeing how we are different through our cultures is through food. You know, an example in the practical guidance is of the cook discussing or looking at what cultures were on board and asking them to tell them what their favourite food was at home and incorporating that onto the menu. And then that becoming a discussion point. So when that dish came up, they could then explain to their other seafarers, why it was important to them, why they enjoyed it, what it meant to them, and was a discussion point and a way of bonding. And I think rather than looking at how we are different through our culture and that being a concern about well-being, actually we can use it to be a method in which to encourage bonding and allow people to discuss what is wonderful about it and actually use that in a really engaging way. And so I think, yes, there is always going to be a concern, and there is, having worked on board vessels where, there might be more than 5 different language speakers on board. You know the challenges you face and inevitably there are cross wires, but actually encouraging the discussion about well-being and how that might be different to different people in different countries actually opens it up, hopefully, into a more safe space to discuss. And I think these very small ways in which we can encourage different cultures to be a positive, there's place for that in these discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. And okay, Stephen?
Yeah, when I was at sea, I served with multicultural crews, and it was always a very positive experience. Lots of friends all over the world from that. One of the really troubling things that has come out of the past year in the Seafarers Happiness Index has been a sense of a bit of division between various nationalities. There has been talk of bullying and harassment between certain nationalities. There's been resentment, I guess the COVID effect of, different countries being affected at different times, some blaming seafarers from a certain place for them not being able to go ashore or get home. So there's a kind of, and I sense a deeper pattern of the frictions on board as the stress levels ramp up. But it's definitely been something of concern and that seafarers of different nationalities don't seem to be getting on as well as perhaps they used to do. And I guess it's understandable in times of great stress, upset and uncertainty, but certainly something I guess we should all be bearing in mind and monitoring closely.
Okay, thanks. Time is passing really fast, so we have time only for a very, very quick question. So the question is, can we leave the employers to take the full responsibility to implement any well-being policies, or we need a different approach? Actually, do we need a regulation? Do we need enforcement for this? Because we know that some companies are very easy escaping responsibility. There are so many flags of convenience and so on. So do we need enforcement or not? Pav, yes.
So I think the issue with enforcement is, how do you enforce poor well-being or good well-being? How do you know, unless you send a psychologist on board every single ship, that it's good or bad and what is and isn't affected by the company? I do agree that there is probably a place for legislation, but I think we need to focus on making sure that as an industry we're moving forward in a way that we are learning from each other, as I said before. And that includes kind of some of the points David touched on in a previous comment about bringing up those organisations that maybe aren't doing so well and where seafarers don't have a choice. So I don't know that enforcement is the way to go. I think legislation potentially, if it's well thought out, could be the way forward. But I think what we need to do is just open up the conversation and keep opening up the conversation and drilling in the message that well-being is important until everyone gets it.
Thank you. Thank you. We don't have time. Okay, Steve, David, very quick.
This isn't Pav and I doing a deliberate tag team on this. I have a different view as counsel is that we do need to have enforcement. You do need to have, we live in a rules-based environment. You have to have legislation, because otherwise companies cannot be held accountable. It is up to the regulators in their legal position to hold them accountable. And when you look at the likes of the IMO member state audit scheme, which is now a treaty obligation, the last one in September last year had 266 pages of over 1,200 paragraphs of failures by flag states because they are not being held to account. So I think to protect the seafarers, we have to have better enforcement, and we need to have better and stronger legislation, as the MLC has been developing over the last couple of years. But this isn't a deliberate setup between Pav and I. But just to round off the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, David. So yes, at this point, I would like to thank you, the panel and the audience, for your contribution to this very, very interesting discussion. The discussion will continue at the conference we have on 25th and 26th. So we're going to have the opportunity to discuss these questions that remained unanswered. And I would like to thank also IMarEST, the IMarEST team, for their valuable support, making happening this discussion, the conference, and also using the IMarEST support to build a special interest group. We are building a community around mental health and well-being. So we'll invite more people to join this group at the conference. Thank you, IMarEST. Thank you for your support, and see you all at the end of this month at the conference. Thank you very much.